It could be real or it could be BS. And I'm trending towards 2 or 3 years from now, it might be total BS.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Real Agile or BS. I'm your host, Agile Peter, and I'm accompanied by my colleague, Agile Bob. Agile Bob, thanks for being here. Let's get into it. So today's idea, so we get a lot of questions from a lot of our students and clients around what is Real Agile and what is BS. And today's topic could be a little prickly. It's about estimating with story points. And so I'm going to leave it over to you, Agile Bob, for the first crack at this. Is that Real Agile or is that BS?
Wow, this is a tough one, Peter, because I think it could be both depending on how people are using it. I think when we talk about story points, we're supposed to be talking about relative sizing, which is probably a good Agile concept. I would be okay with that. But when they start going to a story point is an ideal day or a story point is 3 hours, now we're just talking BS because we've lost the concept of story points and everything like that. But I have to be honest, I'm starting to get away from thinking we need to estimate it all at a sprint level. I'm reading more and more and seeing more and more teams be successful by just saying there's really only two sizes. There's a size of 1 and too big. And we just keep breaking things down smaller and smaller and smaller until they're all size 1 and we know how many fit in our sprint and we go. Obviously you can't do this at the release level, but you're not going to use story points at a release level anyway. So I think depending on how you're using it, it could be real or it could be BS. And I'm trending towards 2 or 3 years from now, it might be total BS.
It could be. So to catch everyone up with a little bit of context, I probably should have talked about this. We're talking about estimating complexity of work. We're talking about how can we, often by the impetus from business, who is asking us for when is it going to be done? When is it going to be done? In Agile, we've come up with multiple ways of looking at estimation. Not all of them are perfect, but the one that we're talking about today is estimating with points. Now, a couple things, 3 things about estimating with points. Number 1, it's highly relative to the team. And so each team will estimate with a point determination that is relative to them and them alone. Number 2, the points are again, not only highly relative, but are specific to the project work that they're working on. It cannot be translated to any other project of complexity. And number 3, it is only for measurement of outcome when it comes to that team. It is not to be used as a comparison mechanism from other teams. This team can do 10 points or this team can do 20 points. It really is a way for the team to track, in a very rudimentary sense, track how they're trending and how they're doing the work over time. Now, let me answer the question. Is estimating with points BS or Real Agile? I think I'm kind of sort of with you a little bit. Having used Agile and Scrum in my own startups, in my own endeavors, I'll tell you from a startup standpoint, we didn't really worry about points all that much. All we cared about is where are we going and are we going to be completing this thing within an iteration. For us, it was 2 weeks for our last project. And it gave us an opportunity to have conversations earlier within the sprint to say, are we going to be making it? And so for us, points was really an opportunity to say, hey, do we need to have a conversation? So that's how I'm seeing it these days is points really for a team is to allow us to have a conversation earlier. Are we trending appropriately? And is it, again, something that management wants to see? The question really is at this point is, how is management interpreting these points? That's something that we could call BS on in a lot of ways because management tends to use these as a comparison mechanism. They tend to use it in inappropriate ways. It often can be a forcing mechanism to add pressure or push onto a team to do more. And so there's a lot of pitfalls to estimating, period, which is probably why maybe some of your, as you're going through this, Agile Bob, you're learning that in a lot of ways it is BS because it can be used inappropriately and against a team more than a helpful mechanism for the team. Is that fair?
Yeah, I actually call it, I call velocity a punishment metric anymore. It's just, if your velocity goes the wrong way, you get punished. And if you can't raise it, you get punished. And to me, we're using a planning tool as a metric and it's too mixed for me. I mean, that's total BS. But I think we've done a poor job of giving management a good way to look at things. So I think we need to do a better job with that. That's probably a different discussion for us. But if we're using points, let's use them appropriately. Let's use them to do relative sizing of things within a single team and let's use them to help us plan our sprint and be successful with our sprints. In that case, we're probably close enough to real Agile that I could buy it. But as soon as we start translating points to time, we are so far out of the realm of reality and so far into BS, you need 3 shovels to get out.
And that's so true, because remember, the context of a lot of what Bob and I are talking about is projects of complexity. We're not talking about projects of simplicity where you're building a chair, or projects of that are complicated, like, you know, building a car where there are a lot of knowns. We're talking about in the context of projects of complexity where there's a lot of unknowns. At the end of the day, one of the most powerful realizations that I often bring to my class and my clients is we often will never know how long it takes to do anything until we're done, especially with projects of complexity where there's so many variables and so many unknowns. And so whenever people move into the, hey, 1 point equals 5 hours, or 1 point equals 2 hours, or this type of notation, we really have to sit on it. And I often take an opportunity to really dig into that with the class and say, hey, when was the last time when you were really able to successfully estimate something complex and unknown? And usually, 99.9% of the time, unless I have someone who has a really unique example, 99% of the time, people can't ever really estimate time. It's just not something within our ability as humans to estimate, because there's so many variables and unknowns. And so there's lots of different pitfalls here when people say, hey, a 1 point equals 2 hours, or 1 hour, or 4 hours, or points equal 1 day of work, or these types of things. I don't find that ever to be helpful. I find that to be a management pressure often to say, hey, you're doing X number of points, that should equal X number of output. I just don't ever find that to be true.
Well, and it goes beyond that too. As soon as we start converting it to time, Peter, it's like, well, whose time? For example, if you and I were programming,
that's a good point.
If it was in assembler or C language, I might outperform you. If it's in Python or Ruby, you would outperform me. So is it my hour or your hour? And who's right and who's wrong? We're both right and we're both wrong. I mean, it's useless.
And so one of the emergent questions here might be, Bob, is that, well, if we're saying that estimating with hours is relative BS, estimating with points is a useful mechanism, mostly for the team, and could be useful for management. An emergent question here could be, well, Bob, what should we use for estimation? I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. I've grew up maybe in the project management world where everything's estimated by hours, and now you're telling me that we estimate by relative complexity and points. Is there a middle ground? Is there a place that I can land, or do I have to choose one or the other? Either live in a culture of BS, or what do I do when I'm living in a culture of BS to help them transition to something that's useful? What would you say there?
Well, that's a really good question, Peter. And I think the culture of BS is where we've been in the past, and historically we haven't performed well. So just estimating in terms of time, as you said, in a complex world, it's just too hard. There's too many, it's not just unknowns, it's unknown unknowns, right? Because in the complicated world, we have known unknowns. There's things we have to figure out and we know it. In the complex world, there's things we have to figure out. We don't even know what they are yet. So estimating for that is just overly difficult. On the other hand, can we estimate using relative size so that a size 1 for me is the same as a size 1 for you? It might take you an hour, it might take me 2 hours, but it's still small for both of us. And use that to determine a relative velocity for the team and move forward with that. Can we do that? I think that's something that's doable. Otherwise, we start getting into the point where we're pre-assigning work to people. We now have a push mechanism, and we're not pulling work. We go against so many lean principles. It's almost uncountable, and we need to break the cycle. I read an interesting book this week, Peter. This is side gig here, but I read a book, and in it said something about status quo bias. And I know that you recognize what status quo bias is, but apparently, I had no idea it was so high. Apparently, 90% of the people will pick the status quo even when they know it's not the best answer. To me, that's shocking. So I think we're calling BS on this, and we're asking people to make that switch, not because it's easy. It's not. It's hard. But what we're doing is failing.
Yeah, I'm gonna question, Bob, if you're really that surprised, because I don't think I've ever been that surprised when someone comes to me and says, hey, this is the way that we've done it. for the last 20 years, so we kind of should do it this way for the next 20 years. I don't know if I'm that surprised these days to usually have that type of conversation or having people have that type of worldview and bringing that into this session or bringing that into Agile and leveraging that. I think in a lot of ways, the question really is how can we continue to be empathetic and educate and help the Scrum Master or help the individuals in our class or our clients realize that there are other opportunities in different ways to do it. And so Agile, there's a lot of different ways to do this. And so I think if we can summarize it up, when it comes to estimating with story points and hours, complete BS. Don't go the hours route, especially if you're working in complexity and unknown unknowns. When it comes to story points, again, it really is specific to the team. It's relative to the team and their project work, and it's used as a mechanism to help the team to not hurt the team. Any additions here, Bob?
I think I just go back to what Ron Jeffries and Chet Hendrickson have said, and they really started the concept of story points, and they said they really regret having started it because it's been abused so badly and perverted so badly. I think at the core, it's a good thing, and teams need to try to embrace it and figure out how to use it well. But don't be distracted by all the BS out there from longtime project management gurus who try to convert it to hours and time and things like that we talked about.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you get to the maturity level of Bob, then, or you might get to a point where the estimations don't matter at all. Maybe that could be a conversation for another time. Thanks so much, everyone out there, for joining us in another episode from Agile for All. Real Agile or BS? See you guys next time.